Good evening, everyone. My name is Selma. I'm the programs coordinator with Heritage Toronto. We're going to get started in a moment, but before we do, we just have some housekeeping and a brief introduction. Um, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to put them in the Q&A function of the Zoom. We'll be sure to address them all at the end, so we'll have a Q&A portion to end off the webinar. So please feel free to drop your questions and we'll get to them at the end. Also, if you have any accessibility issues for any reasons, you can turn on the captions. They should be just to the right of the Q&A function. And that should help you if you're having any trouble hearing or anything like that. But before we get started, we're going to start with a land acknowledgement. So we're going to acknowledge that the land we are standing on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We're also going to acknowledge that this land is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, if you're joining from Toronto. And we're also going to acknowledge that Heritage Toronto, founded in 1949, has in fact contributed to the colonial historical narrative. We are working to amend that by engaging with Indigenous communities to incorporate more of their stories into our programming, and plaques with colonial language are being revised. Indigenous content is being integrated into our walking tours, and in the future, we hope to expand our Indigenous programming even further. Now, a bit about Heritage Toronto, if this is your first time doing any programming with us. So we are an arm's length agency of the City of Toronto, and we're a registered charity. Our mission is to build a better city by bringing people together to explore Toronto's shared past and people's lived experiences. We do this through our walking tours program. So we run walking tours in the spring and summer from around May to October, which being Black on King is one of them. Our State of Heritage report, which comes out around every 4 years, talking about the state of heritage in the city, and our Emerging Historians program. Our tours program has been going strong since 1994. Last year, we actually celebrated 30 years of leading walking tours, exploring and celebrating our city's heritage. I also want to take this time to thank TD Bank through their TD Ready commitment for their support and helping making this program possible. Now, a little bit about your presenter. So Faith Ebanks, she's a Heritage Toronto emerging historian, and she's an art historian whose research focuses on the history of slavery and colonialism throughout the Atlantic world from the 16th to the 21st century. She has an Honours Bachelor of Arts in History and Art History from the University of Toronto, where she actually recently returned for graduate school to obtain her Master's in History. So it's a real treat for us to learn from Faith this evening. And without further ado, I'll let her take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to join me today. Let me share my slides so we can begin this presentation. Oh, good. Okay, great. So yes, today we're going to be presenting Being Black on King. Today we're just going to go through our agenda real quick. But before we go through our agenda, I actually wanted to start off with just two brief reflection questions, just for you to think about. You don't have to write any answers, but I do want you to think about it as we go through this presentation. And we're going to be visiting a lot of Black history that is situated in Toronto, specifically within King Street East and the surrounding neighborhood. So my first question, just for you to think about, is what do you know about Black history in Toronto? What ideas come to mind? What have you learned in the past, whether through your own reflections, through your own reading, through school? What have you learned about Black history specifically within Toronto? And can you name any sites near where you are, right? Whether you're in Toronto, whether you're in Ontario, Canada, anywhere in the world, can you name any sites near you that are related to Black history? So our agenda for today, we're going to be starting off with the story of Thornton and Lucie Blackburn and talk about the long journey that they had to reach Toronto. Then we're going to talk about St. Lawrence Hall and the North American Convention of Colored Freemen that took place. Then we're going to talk about Mary Ann Shedd Cary, and then we're going to jump over to the Enoch Schoolhouse and talk about racial segregation in Canadian public schools. Then we're going to go to the Freedman's Bank and talk about this huge exploitation scheme that took place there. And then we're going to talk about Albert Jackson and then the Underground Railroad restaurant and talking about the origins of soul food. So let's just hop right in. So our very first stop is talking about Thornton and Lucie Blackburn. Like I said, a really long journey that they took to reach Toronto. And so it all begins in Kentucky, right? And so both Thornton and Lucie were enslaved in Kentucky. And not long after meeting each other, they actually decided to get married. They couldn't actually legally get married because of the law of being enslaved is that those who were held to be property under law could not actually be married. But they decided to escape together on July 3rd, 1831, the day right before Independence Day for the United States, which was very on brand as they were seeking their own independence. And so once they escaped, they were able to arrive to Detroit. Um, First it was Cincinnati, and then they went over to Detroit. And when they arrived in Detroit, they were actually quickly integrated into the Black community that was there. It wasn't really large, but they were quickly accepted. And they were there for 2 whole years. And while they were there, they were just integrated. The community became heavily involved. But just one day, randomly in 1833, a man spotted Thornton from Kentucky. So a man from Kentucky saw Thornton when he was out on the street minding his business, and then reported him and Lucie to their respective owners. And this whole reporting situation actually spurred what is known as the Blackburn riots of 1833. So if we were in Detroit, is quite well known there. There's usually plaques and information there. Unfortunately, of course, in Toronto, we don't have that. But near the site where the Blackburns eventually would move to, there are plaques there that talk about their lives, but they're not extremely accessible, mostly because they're on school property. So it's not really easy for people who are passing by the spot to see, which become really important when I talk about their story a bit more in a minute. But the Blackburn riots of 1833 start because when the Black community in Detroit hear that the Blackburns are going to be returned back to slavery in Kentucky, they actually threatened the court system that they were going to burn the city to the ground if they did that. And so the courts, they didn't really listen. They didn't agree. They didn't take this threat very seriously. And so the next day, or the day before they're going to be sent off back to Kentucky, two women actually stayed with Lucie in her jail cell, and they stayed with her all night. And then at nighttime, actually, one of them decided to escape with her. So they left, and then Lucie was able to leave. One swapped places with her, swapped clothes, and Lucie was able to escape to the Detroit side of the river. And so the next day, Thornton is actually still in his cell. And while he's still in his cell, he's there the whole time and he's in his jail cell, probably like right within like the doors of his cell, and he's going to be sent away any moment. But then you hear this crowd outside, and outside of this crowd, there's a whole group of like 200 armed people storming the jailhouse, and they're able to rescue Thornton. And so he's able to escape with about seven or so of his rescuers, and they also make it to the Detroit side of the river. And so now they're all reunited, and they're technically now in Canada. And so this is important that this is 1833, right? So 1833 in Canada, there was a Slavery Abolition Act, and that was supposed to end slavery. And that will be a theme that we're going to see a lot during this presentation. And I'm going to use quotations a lot when I say end of slavery or abolition or emancipation. It's really important to understand when we're talking about the histories of slavery and colonialism that end of isn't actually a thing or a concept, because these systems usually took place a lot longer after they were formally abolished. And not to mention that the systems that come out of these two ideas progress much longer, even into the present day. So we have to be really careful about how we use the word end. But I say the word end here to say that there was the Slavery Abolition Act that comes out in 1833, passes in 1834, so that when Lucie and Thornton Blackburn arrive in Toronto, or Canada more so, at this time, they're technically safe. At least so we thought, right? So they're in Toronto, sorry, no, Ontario at this point. They haven't reached Toronto yet, but they're in the Detroit side of the river. So they're up in Lake Michigan, or Windsor, Ontario today. That's where they are. And so while they're there, immediately they're apprehended by the mayor of Detroit, right? He puts out this notice for them saying that he wants to try them for civil unrest and the attempted murder of a sheriff who was injured during the riots in the jailhouse. But at this point, the Sir John Corwin, he actually interferes on their behalf. And so he was the Prime Minister of Upper Canada at this point, and he intercedes on their behalf, and he makes sure that they're able to stay within Canada, enforcing the extradition law, which makes it so that Canadian law cannot punish people in a way that Canadian law would allow. So Canada can't actually send somebody to another jurisdiction, another country, for example, where the law there would be harsher than Canadian law would punish. So because slavery was no longer legal in Canada, they couldn't send them back, or they wouldn't send them back to the United States. And so they stay in this Detroit area, or the Ontario area, for a little while until they actually moved to Toronto. And they moved to Toronto, and they actually build their house right on the front lawn. So right where you see this schoolhouse, this is the schoolhouse that actually is still there on the property. And it was actually originally called the Sackville Street Public School, and eventually it was renamed to the Inglenook Community School, located at 19 Sackville Street. And so this house faces, well, it's not the house here, but this empty lawn that you're seeing is where they would have built their house. And it was facing Eastern Avenue. And so they built their house here, and no one would have known about it from this picture taken in 1952. And the only reason why we actually know about the Blackburn story is because of an archaeological dig that took place in 1985. And so this actually became the first site of an Underground Railroad dig in Canada. So there's quite a huge and important spot in Canadian history. It takes place in 1985, led by Dr. Carolyn Smart Frost. And so she leads this archaeological dig, and she finds out a lot more about the Blackburns. And so she starts to learn about just how significant these two people were, because once they reached Toronto, they didn't just sit their home there and that was it. That wasn't the end of their story. They actually eventually established Toronto's very first taxi company all the way in 1837. And so Thornton was actually working as a waiter at Osgoode Hall, and he overheard this conversation about something called a hackney cab that was actually being used in Montreal. And he was like, well, Toronto could really use a form of transportation like that. So he decided to have a taxi cab built, and they painted it yellow and red, and they called it the City. And if anyone is familiar with the TTC logo from the 1970s, if you look at the logo, even if you just search it up, you'll notice that the logo is red and yellow, which is the exact same colors as Thornton and Lucie's original taxi cab, which is exactly where the TTC logo actually got their color inspiration from. And so they established Toronto's very first taxi company. Thornton runs it himself, and he actually has his like taxi cab stand right outside of on Church Street, right outside of St. James Cathedral, so right in the same neighborhood. And so this site is also important because they also use their home as an Underground Railroad site. And so they use their house, and one of the people that actually stayed with them his name was Albert Jackson, and we're going to talk about him a bit sooner in this coming up. But him and his family actually stayed with the Blackburns for a little while. But yeah, they were hugely important in their neighborhood. And what I was mentioning about the plaques not being really able to see you really easily is that this story is a huge and important moment, right, in Canadian history. And it's not something that many people know, right? Not a lot of people are familiar with the Blackburns if you just say their name. And even though there are two plaques that are right there, because they're on school property and sometimes there's trees kind of blocking it, not a lot of people are going to know about that. And so it's one of those themes that comes out of this whole tour, this presentation, is understanding that there's so many important moments in Black history that are overlooked, and things that even are in plain sight, but they're not things that people generally know about. And so we're going to move on to our next site. And what you're actually seeing here is actually a picture of the Blackburns' taxi cab at Scadding Cabin in 1895. Right here on the side here, if I zoom in, you can see a little bit better. But this was sent over to Scadding Cabin in 1895, much later than after the Blackburns had actually passed away, unfortunately. But this is like the only picture that we actually get to see of what the cabin would have looked like. So our next stop is the North American Convention of Colored Freemen. And so this is at St. Lawrence Hall. It took place in 1851. And it was organized by Henry and Holly Bibb on September 11th, 1851. And so the reason why this convention took place, it was actually took place right after, or not long after, the hall was actually finished being built. And so they decided to have this convention because of something called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 passes in 1851 or 1850, but it was actually the second version of an act by the same name. So the very first version of the act actually came out in 1783. And that act is actually what established or really progressed the need for the Underground Railroad itself. And so the Underground Railroad was supposed to be a system that helped abolitionists and other people help freedom seekers get to either to other parts of the United States or to Canada. And so the underground system was underground because it was supposed to be extremely secret, right? So it was only really known about through word of mouth, through maps. But of course, it was an actual outline system, even though there are maps that kind of detail where these certain routes would have been. And so the Fugitive Slave Act of 1783 was an act that was supposed to allow slaveholders or enslavers to actually retrieve enslaved people who managed to escape from their enslavement. And so the second act comes out in 1850 at a really particular time, around the time that in the southern states of the United States, they were actually threatening to separate from the Union. So the southern states were still practicing slavery really strongly. And they were deciding like, well, we're going to separate from the rest of the Union if you don't give us a revised version of this act, or if you don't make some harsher laws to enforce the continuation of the system of slavery. And so what's important to also understand is that by 1804, the northern states had started to slowly introduce acts around abolition, right? So slavery wasn't actually abolished yet, but they were starting to be in conversation about this. And this was important because when we're thinking about his system of slavery in the southern and northern states, usually when enslaved people would escape from the southern states, they would go to the north, right? So this is why Thornton and Lucie Blackburn, for example, they left from Kentucky, which is a southern state, and then they moved over to Detroit, which is a northern state. But then we know that actually didn't work out for them because Thornton was spotted, and then they had to eventually move over to Canada. So we see why there's these patterns of traveling to different places. So the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is exceptionally important, and there's a whole reason why a convention was framed around it, was because it was so much harsher than the first version. So the second act made it so that everyday citizens could be deputized. So they call it deputized citizens, can make what we call like civil citizens arrest, right? So everyday people could find enslaved people, arrest them, and bring them back to enslavement. And then there are also agents. So these agents were initiated by the US government, and they were actually getting paid to find enslaved people, whether in the North or the South. They were actually usually operating in the North because they knew that enslaved people would usually go over into the North, but they were getting paid, right? So they're highly incentivized to arrest as many enslaved people as they could find, which meant that a lot of the people that they were arresting weren't actually enslaved people, or they were also people who were born free. So now people who were born free are being enslaved for the very first time. And so Henry Bibb, he's realizing like this is a really huge moment, right? This is a really dangerous moment, because enslaved people aren't having any extra option of finding some kind of solace, some kind of place to go. And so they call for this convention and they hold it in Canada, knowing that obviously they couldn't hold it in the United States at this time. And they have a conversation about next steps, right? Like, what do we do next? Where are we going to go? And so they hold this convention at St. Lawrence Hall in 1851. And they also invite some delegates, some people to talk about their experiences. And one of these people are actually Thornton Blackburn himself. He was able to come to the convention, and he talked about his experience living in Toronto and how that was like for him. And so they came to the conclusion that Canada would be a better option for Black immigration at this time. And because of this convention, they actually saw a huge population rise, a huge rise in the Black population in Canada. So there's a huge significant rise. And the Fugitive Slave Act doesn't end until 1864, when the Emancipation Proclamation is signed at the end of the Civil War, right? That formally abolishes slavery, which wasn't true, right? So a lot of slaveholding states continued to practice slavery long after. And something that many people don't know about the Emancipation Proclamation is that it only extended to Confederate states. So other Southern states that technically were not part of the Confederacy could continue to practice in slavery. So that's a whole other history in and of itself, but it is important to understand that these laws are not specific, or they're not rigid, in the fact that what we hear as end is a very loose term. And so this convention is held here, is in a big moment in history. And so the person we're going to move over to next, oh, sorry, actually, first, this is a picture of Henry Bibb, just to give you a sense of who he looked like. But we're actually moving to Mary Ann Shadd, because she was actually one of the people who attended the Convention of Colored Freemen. And she attended it with her father around in 1851. She attended with him. She came over from the United States, and when she went and she attended the convention, she was actually really inspired by what she heard, and she actually let it inspire a lot of her work that she continued to do. So Mary Ann Shadd was actually born in 1823 in Delaware, and she's born to a free abolitionist family. And so eventually her family actually moved her and her siblings to Pennsylvania, because unfortunately there weren't a lot of opportunities for education for Black children within Delaware. And so they moved them over to Pennsylvania, and she's able to get an education there. But Marianne Shedd does something really inspiring, right? By the age of 16, she actually goes back to Delaware and she opens a school for Black children. And so she continued to teach for quite a while. And so by the 1850s, she's actually been teaching in like various states, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware. And so she'd been teaching for quite a while. And it's around this time, leading up to the moment that she goes to the convention with her father in 1851, that Henry Bibb actually contacts her and was like, well, you're doing a lot of teaching in the United States. Could you maybe do that here in Canada, right? And so she's thinking about it for a little while. But then she goes to convention and she's meeting with Henry Bibb again. And then she decides really, well, that actually sounds like a good idea. And so she actually just kind of decides to move to Ontario. And then when she moves to Ontario, she actually decides to establish the Provincial Freeman, which was an anti-slavery newspaper. So she established that in 1851. And that whole newspaper was meant to inspire conversations about abolition, inspire people to be involved in abolition, teaching them about enslavement, and also just to promote the works of other Black like entrepreneurs and to give them a platform to be able to promote their work. And so this is a really important moment, and there's a really important newspaper. And she was publishing at different places, but at one point around 18 in the 1850s, she had actually started publishing from King Street East. So there's actually a building like at 144 King Street East. There is a Heritage Toronto plaque there. And there's a part that talks about her life there, but she actually was publishing from that site for a short while. Unfortunately, the newspaper wasn't successful for too long. It had a lot of ups and downs, a lot of bumps and bruises, unfortunately. And it didn't help also that she was a woman doing this, so she had a lot of pushback. But she persevered as much as she can to make sure that the newspaper stayed afloat as much as it could. But unfortunately, it didn't last too long, and it kind of closed down close to the end 1860s, around the same time that her husband actually passed away. But around that time, she actually decided to move back to the United States, and she started becoming a recruiter for the Union Army and recruiting Black soldiers to become part of the Union Army. And then not long then later after that, she actually decided to get a law degree, and she actually became one of the first Black women to earn a law degree. But even before that, with her newspaper, she's the very first Black woman in North America. So not just in Canada, not just the United States, first Black woman in North America to edit and publish a newspaper. So she's a very prominent figure, and she inspired a lot of other Black women and other people to do their own goals and reach these own goals and understand that it is something that is possible for people to achieve. And so I made a joke the other day that I like to call her the Jacqueline of all trades, or the Jackie of all trades, because she just does so much. But she is another known figure, and sometimes even though it is a name that people do start to recognize, she's not the most prominent figure. And so this is an opportunity to rectify that and to highlight more of these people who made really huge contributions to Toronto and Canadian history. And so we're going over to the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse. And so here we're talking about this schoolhouse, right? So this is located on Trinity Street. So this is right off of King Street East, but it's all within the same neighborhood and impacts the same area. And so this school was really interesting for me when I was learning about this school, because when you just see it, you just see the school, right? You don't see any immediate connections to any other history. But the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse was built in 1849. It ran from 1849 to 1850, 1849 to 1859, and it was established by a man called Enoch Turner. But the reason why he decided to establish the school was because of something called the Common Schools Act of 1846. So it was 1846, 1847. And this Common Schools Act was meant to give municipalities like Toronto, different areas, the opportunity to raise public schools. But in order to do that, they had to raise funds through taxation. And so a lot of these municipalities didn't actually want to introduce these taxes. And so they were forced to, any school that received public support had to shut down for about a year until they figured out what to do next. And so it was around this time that Enoch Turner was like, well, I'll just establish my own school. And so he establishes the school and he builds it. And most of the students who actually went to his school were students who were children of poor immigrants from Ireland, particularly from Cork in Ireland, which is why this area is actually known as Cork Town. And so those were the children who the predominant groups of children who went to the school. But the reason why this site is so important isn't just because of the school itself, but because of the history that it's connected to. And so Enoch Turner opens the school because of the Common Schools Act. But the Common Schools Act which we'll get back to. But the Common Schools Act is written by a very particular person who we will talk about in a moment. But the Common Schools Act was actually amended in 1850. And so when it was amended in 1850, something called the Separate Schools Clause was added, and it was what allowed racial segregation to start. So the Separate Schools Clause was supposed to allow different groups. So Black communities, Catholic communities, Protestant communities, they could open their own separate schools if they wanted. But then the school trustees around this time, they saw this opportunity and they're like, well, this sounds like a really good opportunity to introduce racial segregation in schools. And so Ontario and Nova Scotia are the only two provinces that actually formally introduced this racial segregation, although there's a lot of other provinces that also practice it informally. It's just Ontario and Nova Scotia that decided to legislate it. So they wanted to make it official. And so Ontario practices racial segregation in schools across different communities. Sometimes they would have just separate schools built. Sometimes they would make sure that Black and white students or different groups of students would go to schools at different times, or they would have the same school buildings and they would just have to be seated at different benches, right? So the ways that they would practice this racial segregation just differed according to what school it is, what city it was, what part of the province, and so on. But one thing I always ask people when I say, when you hear this and you know, like it started in 1850, Ontario legislates it, how long would you assume, right, that this lasted for? And some people think, oh, like 50 years, right? Maybe 60 years, 70 years. It was actually 114 years, right? So they hold it for 108, what, 104, yeah, 114 years. And it only ends because of a man called Leonard Braithwaite. So it's this man right here. So Leonard Braithwaite, he was the first Black man to be an MPP, so a member of provincial parliament. So that in Canada is, he would have worked at Queen's Park as a provincial member of provincial parliament. And this is a big historical moment, right? He's the first Black person, first Black man to be a member of provincial parliament. And he makes a really bold move, right? In his very first speech to the parliament, he suggests that, well, he demands actually, that the clause be removed. And 1 month later, it's gone, right? So 1 month later, the clause is gone, and they're finally closing in, they're ending this practice of racial segregation. But that's 114 years. Nova Scotia, on the other hand, they held on to it for just a little bit longer, and that was 134 years. So they hold it on to it for another 2 decades or so. And so we're thinking about racial segregation in school. That sounds really absurd, right? That doesn't sound something that feels right? That doesn't sound usual because that, even though this is just a really recent point in human history or even just Canadian history, but it's again in that way that the myths around history happen is that we kind of fool ourselves into believing that certain moments in history are much further in the past than they actually are. But then for another point of reference, I said that I would talk about who wrote the Common Schools Act, right, all the way in 1846. And it was this man, Egerton Ryerson. So anyone who might be familiar with Egerton Ryerson might be familiar with him, even just from the name Ryerson from Ryerson University, that was recently renamed to Toronto Metropolitan University. And they renamed it because Ryerson was heavily involved in the conduct of residential schools. And so residential schools were operated and by the Canadian government and various churches. And they were orchestrated together and they were used to forcefully assimilate Indigenous children. And so even though these things were called schools, they were really institutions, right? Institutions that Indigenous students who were forced to go to these schools experience all forms of abuse, right? So there's a lot of children who never returned home, never children who were never seen again, many children who were killed, unfortunately. And you've heard in the news, you've heard a lot about like the recovery of bodies and things from these schools. It was a really a sadistic institution, right? And a huge part of Canadian history that even when people do become familiar with this point in history, sometimes do downplay, right? And don't really discuss it a lot because for some people it's contrary to their notions of what Canada is and Canadian history. But the whole point of this presentation is highlighting how so many of these elements of history are not just interconnected, but they're overlooked and they're undermined, even though they continue to be the lived experience of the people who went through these institutions and these forms of systems. And so he writes the very first act of the Common Schools Act, which is actually still the foundation of our public school system, right? And so it's still there. And he writes this act. He's also involved in the conduct of residential schools. So we see the link between these two institutions, right? Someone who can be heavily involved in the practice of residential schools that is meant to assimilate Indigenous children also creates our system or establishes our system of public schooling does allow you to think of, well, what is education in Canada? How has education been used? And what does it actually serve a purpose? Like, how does it serve a purpose? Especially if we're thinking about just how much history isn't taught within our education system and what histories aren't taught. It's not a coincidence. And so the picture you're seeing on the right is actually the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario. And it was actually the very first residential school to be opened. So the very first residential school is opened in Ontario, and that's opened all the way in 1831. But the very last residential school is always a big one, right? When you again you think, well, how long did the residential school system last? It lasted for 165 years because the very last residential school doesn't close until 1996. Right. So that's not long ago, right? And so again, it's that reminder that if anyone is like in their 40s, if they're in their 50s or so on, these are people who can remember actually being in residential schools. It's not something they have to look to their parents or their grandparents for. They themselves can also remember that experience, which reminds us just how relevant and close these moments in history truly are. Um, and so, yeah, so that's again that reminder of just how we see space and understand our history in Toronto. So we're going to move over to our next stop. And this is a complicated one. This is a really long one. And so we're going to go through a little chronology. And we're going to start all the way from 1825. So in 1825, there's something called the Halifax Banking Company. And so that was established by a man called Enoch Collins in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So he establishes that bank, right? But then we're going to jump to 1865. So in 1865, there's establishment of something called the Freedmen's Bank or the Freedman Savings Bank. And that's established in the very same year that slavery was abolished in the United States. And so this is on purpose, right? Because the bank was established by white abolitionists, philanthropists, business owners right in 1865. And they decided to establish this bank because, as the name says, Freedmen's Bank, they decided, well, this would be a good opportunity to get people who were recently enslaved to deposit all their money in one bank, right? So all these recently emancipated people, they could put all their money into one bank, right? And so if it sounds lucrative, if it sounds suspicious, that's because it is, right? So they established this bank and it's being really successful, it's doing really well. And they're opening various banks and branches across the United States, particularly within the southern states. Again, very suspicious. But then something happens in 1873, and that's called the Panic of 1873. Now, the reason why this thing is called the Panic of 1873 is because of this failure of this company called J. Cook and Co., right? So he also owned a bank, and his bank goes bankrupt because he got a loan from this Freedman's Bank. And the Freedman's Bank, they weren't actually giving any collateral. They weren't actually documenting the loans that they were giving out. So they were doing so well with the bank that they eventually decided, like, we're going to go to Congress, ask them if we can give out loans. And in 1870, Congress agrees and gives them the right to give out loans. And so they start giving out loans, but these bank owners, the bank president, all the trustees, they start giving out the loans to their friends, right? People who had social and political ties to them. Those are the people that they're giving the money to. So all the people who were recently emancipated, who had deposited their money into this bank, they weren't seeing any of that money back, right? So all the money just went to predominantly white business owners, which is why I say this is a huge, massive exploitation scheme that they capitalized on this moment of emancipation, marketed to seem that it was supposed to be an opportunity for enslaved people to have an opportunity to have a system for specifically for themselves, but they knew right off the bat they were going to use it for this whole scheme. And so 1873, the Panic of 1873 begins because of the failure of Jay Cook, because he gets a $50,000 loan. He can't pay back because his company goes bankrupt. And so then in 1875, there's something called the Bank of Niagara District, and it merges with the Imperial Bank of Canada. So this Freedman's Bank situation is happening all the way in the United States, but the trickle effect of the bankruptcy of Jay Cook trickles all the way over to Canada because this Bank of Niagara District has to merge with the Imperial Bank because of this panic. And then they merge and they just become the Imperial Bank of Canada. So the Bank of Niagara District as a name no longer exists, which is really tricky for me when I was doing research on this because I was like, what happened to the Bank of Niagara District? Like, where did it go? And then I learned that as banks start to merge, some of the names disappear, and then the trail kind of runs cold, and you have to look to the next bank. You're like, okay, that's where the bank went. But it's important to understand because when we talk about the trajectory of like where does the money go, where does this economy, where does this system connect to, it's important to understand that it's usually a really long trail that you have to trace in order to understand what's going on. And so Bank of Niagara District merges with the Imperial Bank of Canada. But then we jump all the way a few decades to 1903. And there's the Halifax Banking Company that I mentioned in 1825. The Halifax Banking Company merges with the Canadian Bank of Commerce. So now the Canadian Bank of Commerce is its own bank, and then it merges with Enoch Collins um, Bank in 1903. But by 1903, Enoch Collins is no longer alive, right? And his bank, though, is particularly important for what I'm going to say next because of who Enoch Collins was, right? So Enoch Collins was a privateer. And as a privateer, he made his money off of supplying to slave colonies in the Caribbean. So I always make a joke that he's called a legal pirate. So he's basically practicing piracy, but he's working under the government. And so by doing that, he's able to engage in maritime warfare, but he is flying under a flag basically through the government, so he's able to do it legally. But he's gaining his money by participating in the slave economy, and that's how he's generating all his money, which is why it's suspicious when in 1903 his company merges with the Canadian Bank of Commerce. And so to understand, we jump to 1961. The Canadian Bank of Commerce now merges with the Imperial Bank of Commerce, the Imperial Bank of Canada. So there's a typo there. Imperial Bank of Canada, which merges together, forming the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, otherwise known as CIBC. So I know that is confusing, it is complicated, and if there's any way that I can clear that up, I will. But CIBC, right? Now, the point of this isn't to isolate CIBC only, right? This is many other Canadian banks, but it's to understand Canadian institutions in general, right? So we're thinking about the age of Canada. How old is Canada? How old is the United States? Regardless, it's that both of them are younger than the institution of slavery itself. So when we think about that and we understand why is that important, is how can we understand Canadian history? How can we understand the United States history without understanding that both of these countries are younger than the institutions that built them, that they're fundamentally grown out of? And so when we think about what slavery is and the economy of enslavement, all that free labor, that forced free labor, builds up the Canadian economy. It builds up the US economy and is what allows it to modernize. And so we think about all the things that we enjoy, right? This idea of modernization, of industrialization. Where does this come from? Right? So when we see this trajectory, this really specific chronology is mapping out these trails. Where did this money go? If Enoch Collins can be a privateer making his money supplying to the slave colonies and actually becoming one of the most um, what's the word? Rich men in North America by the time of his death in around 1871, if he can be one of the richest men supplying to the slave colonies and he can establish a bank that becomes part of another bank that is now a modern bank, does that money just disappear and is something completely separate? No, right? The money flows through to different places, and it makes us rethink how we understand these different economies that we are not just a part of, but the economy that is around us and the very fabric of our country itself, especially when we're talking previously about racial segregation in schooling and how these institutions come from somewhere where they're formed for a specific reason. They operate in a specific way. We understand that we have to rethink and more so to isolate and prioritize conversations about the history of slavery and colonialism, not just in the United States, because it's easy to do so. We do that often, but understanding how much Canada is also part of that conversation. So these two pictures here, we just see an illustration of the Great Financial Panic of 1873, closing its doors to the stock exchange closing the doors to the stock exchange. So it was a really huge moment at that time, and particularly within the United States, it probably would have been a lot more well known. It had a lot more of an impact. But like I said, it did have a lot of trickle effect over into Canada. And on the right, you're seeing Enoch Collins from around 1870, just to give you a sense. But this next picture is obviously very offensive. But we included here because it's important to understand the goals and the motivations of this bank. So when I said that they opened this bank and they had the intent from the very beginning that this was going to be malicious, this was never about prioritizing the well-being of enslaved populations, these kind of advertisements show that, right? So this is a racist caricature from the Freedman Bureau in Pennsylvania in 1866. And it shows a lot of the same kind of information and the same kind of ideologies that came out during this time. This idea that enslaved people were somehow lazy, that they needed to be taught how to save money, that they needed to be taught how to be productive members of society. And so the bank is established, and they're saying, like, we're going to teach enslaved people how to be frugal, and we're going to teach them how to save money and to be upright. And there's the same kind of rhetoric that we often hear, but there's no payoff to that, right? It's just a scheme. And so this is around the same time, 1866, and the year after that, the bank opens, but it gives you a sense about the motivations of the bank and what their intentions were. And so we see this scheme, and it's again a reminder of remembering how history is written. These things don't happen in secret. They're not these things that we just pull up now and we're like, oh, these ideas just suddenly sprang out. They were very overt from the beginning, that from the moment that they're happening. And so we're moving on to our next person. Um, this one's a bit more easy to follow. We're talking about Albert Jackson. This is a picture of him here, and it's one of those things I always really enjoy, being able to include images of the people that I talk about. A lot of the people, the institutions, the places, there aren't usually pictures of them. I mean, you saw when we talked about Lucie and Thornton Blackburn, there weren't any images of them specifically for me to show you, but we actually get to have a picture of Albert Jackson, which is always just nice to be able to include. But this is the story of Toronto's very first Black letter carrier. And so he was born in Delaware in 1857. And I told you at the beginning that Lucie and Thornton Blackburn actually used their home as an Underground Railroad stop, and that one of the people who stayed with them was Albert Jackson and his family. So Anne Maria Jackson, Albert's mother, escaped to Canada with her children not long after Albert was born, actually. And the reason why was because Albert was actually the youngest of 9 children. And his 2 older brothers were actually sold into slavery. And when that happened, their father actually died from grief. And so right after that happened, Anne Maria Jackson was like, okay, we're not staying here, we're going to leave. And so she takes her 7 remaining children and she actually goes through the Underground Railroad, she gets help, and she escapes to Canada. And so through that long journey, she arrives to Canada and she stays with the Blackburns when she arrives. When she reaches Toronto, she stays with them. And so they stay with the Blackburns for little while, and then they eventually move to what was known as St. John's Ward. In Toronto, that's kind of where the Eaton Center is, Old City Hall, that kind of area is where St. John's Ward used to be. And they stay in this area for a little while, and they actually make enough money working in the ward to send Albert to school. So they send him to school, and when he finishes his studies, he actually applies to the Toronto General Post Office, and he's hired. He's hired as a letter carrier in 1882, and he's assigned as a letter carrier to the General Post Office. So that was actually on Adelaide Street. So that's right off of Adelaide Street East, is right off of King Street East. So again, all within the same neighborhood. And he gets hired in 1882. But he is hired and then he loses the job or he gets demoted, particularly because his white coworkers refused to train him. And so without any training, he couldn't do the job, but he gets demoted as a janitor. So now he's working as a janitor, and the Quebec community actually protest on his behalf. And so they protest for him to be reinstated, and he actually does, but only like a couple days later, a couple weeks later. But it was talked about in the news a lot. It was a huge moment. And even this man called George Washington Smith, he actually goes to Sir John A. Macdonald, who was on the way to being prime minister. And it was voting season, which is important to remember for a reason, because they talk to him, they tell him about Albert's case. And then 3 days later or so, Albert gets his job back. And he's working there at the post office. He's finally reinstated. But he's actually just worked there for about 36 years, until around 1918, his death in 1918. But he actually worked within the Harvard Village area within Toronto. But the reason why this is so important and why this conversation kind of connects to our other themes is because Albert Jackson's story was probably one in a million, right? This huge important story, but we can only think about how many other Black people were hired for jobs or couldn't obtain jobs, and then were not able to work within those environments because of racial discrimination, job discrimination, and so on, and not being able to have that moment of actually being within those, not being in those jobs or not even being hired in the first place. And we can also think about how many people didn't have someone or groups to protest on their behalf to make sure that they're getting fair treatment. And so why I mentioned that this was voting season was because John A. Macdonald saw an opportunity. He's like, well, if I help and I interfere, maybe I can actually start getting Black votes. And so by helping Albert Jackson, this was a huge opportunity for him to profit himself. And so we don't know if that was particularly his primary motivation, but it is something to think about, right? When we give credit to certain people within history and say, well, this person's a great person because they advocated on this person's behalf and they were involved in this. Sometimes you also have to remember that people do have ulterior motives, right? Not everything is clean cut. Not everything as as good sometimes as it seems. And that's important for understanding how we view history. And the credit that we give out is understanding who really moves the wheels for making change happen, right? Because how did John and McDonald know about Albert Jackson's case? Well, George Washington Smith, he's the one who brought it to his attention. Protests were happening, but the protests were happening by the Black community who rallied on his behalf, which sounds a lot familiar, really familiar to the Blackburns' story when I told you that the Black community in Detroit is the one who rioted on their behalf to make sure that they weren't returned to slavery in Kentucky. It's a really similar story. And when I spoke to you about, the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse, and I said how long racial segregation took place and how Leonard Braithwaite had to be the one to make sure that was removed, makes you think how long would it have stayed for if he hadn't actually stepped in. And then we talk about the separate schools clause, and then we talk about residential schools, how long that system took place. But then we think about Black history, right? It is Black History Month. Happy Black History Month, by the way. And we think about Black History Month, and we think, well, we learned it for so long, and we think that it's something that has always just been, celebrated and acknowledged. But it wasn't until 2016 that the Canadian government gave it royal assent, that made it a formal law, thing that you actually had to celebrate. That was only in 2016. But it's again the rethinking and the reshaping, even though for a really long time the Black community had to rally in behalf to make sure that Black History Month was something that was prioritized and actually taught. But another thing to also highlight and why this is all connected is Emancipation Day. So I don't know how many people are actually familiar with Emancipation Day, but that's celebrated every month on August, well, not every month, every year on August 1st. And it's supposed to celebrate the Slavery Abolition Act that was passed in 1833, the same act that I spoke to you about when we talked about Lucie and Thornton Blackburn. And so the Slavery Abolition Act is passed all the way in 1834, well, it comes out in 1833, passes in 1834. But Emancipation Day is supposed to celebrate that day. But it was only in 2021 that the Canadian government formally recognized it. So they recognized before, they said, well, yeah, Emancipation Day, that's great if you want to celebrate it. Yeah, that happened, that existed, that's wonderful. But it was only 3 years ago, 4 years ago now, that the Canadian government actually gave it formal recognition, making it an actual required practice around the whole all around Canada, which again shows us how much these moments in history are overlooked. Even when the government does acknowledge it and say, yeah, that happens, that exists, you can do it, the act of formally recognizing shows the actual initiation of making it official and shows that it's something they're actually prioritizing. So it's again that understanding about how we think about history, who is actually involved, and how we give credit. People probably were like, well, that's great that the Canadian government finally acknowledged this, but what they're not seeing is 188 years before that where they weren't. And so, but Edward Jackson's story, even just within this moment of just talking about, Toronto's very first Black letter carrier, was part of this other history of the need for engagement of Black communities having to be their own advocates constantly in order for change to happen, and even receiving pushback even as they're trying to make that change possible. And so the picture you're seeing on the left is the picture of the Toronto General Post Office. Unfortunately, it's no longer standing. It was demolished in 1953. But this is a picture of it. So this is where he would have been working. And then the building that's on the site right now is called like the Dream Office, is right along Adelaide Street East. And the other side you see Heritage Toronto plaque actually. And the picture that you're seeing on the right is again Albert Jackson and his family from 1880 or so. But again, is being able to see him, his actual face, and being able to see his family is another thing of moment of understanding. These are real people, right? They're not just people that we make up in books. They're not just people that are fictionalized. They're real people who lived in our city and who have histories that we can only imagine that there's so many others like them. And this is also another photo that I really like and I really enjoy because you have to zoom in to see it. So this is a group of Toronto letter carriers featuring Albert Jackson in 1892. But if I zoom in right here in the back, you see he's right here in the back. But again, it's one of those things that I always find really interesting because it makes you think of all how many historical figures are just hiding in the backgrounds of photos. I was thinking about that, which is like the idea that we start to learn about these people and they become real over time, but how many of them kind of just disappear into the background, right? So I just thought that was a picture I love to share. And so we're actually on our last stop. So this is the Underground Railroad Restaurant. Has a lot of alliteration. So Underground Railroad Restaurant. And talking about the origins of soul food. And so this is a picture here of Howard Matthews. He was one of the owners and the establishers of the Underground Railroad Restaurant. It was originally opened in Bloor Street, but it did so well that they actually moved over to King Street East. And so they opened it in 1969, and it became Toronto's first black-owned, one of Toronto's first black-owned soul food restaurants. And so not a lot of people are actually familiar with the history of soul food, particularly in Canada, which makes sense. Soul food is not usually a most well-known cuisine here, mostly because it wasn't really established here at all. But it did become really important, particularly in the 1960s, around the civil rights movement in the United States, when there were black populations from the United States coming over to Canada. It was really important for people to have soul food, also just because it's a really warm and welcoming cuisine. Who doesn't enjoy it in some capacity or familiar with it? And so it was a huge, the restaurant itself was just a really warm and inviting space for people from all backgrounds just to be in one particular space. And there's a lot of people who kind of remember it, even though the restaurant closed permanently in 1989. But it was a huge, it was an important place within the community when it was open. But the origins of soul food is always really fascinating because it's a reminder of just how, the history resides in buildings, it resides in people, it resides in spaces and books. But food is one of those things that has a huge history because it's the way that people create, is one of the ways that people create and the way that people consume, but it's also the way that people survive. And that's what soul food is. Soul food is a cuisine that's built out of survival. And so it originates actually in West Africa, all the way from like the 1400s. So soul food is like 600 plus years old, right? It's a really old cuisine we're talking about its foundations. And it's established by West African people. And because West Africans were eventually moved out of West Africa, taken out of West Africa, brought to various parts of the world through the transatlantic slave trade, and particularly through what's known as the Middle Passage. So the Middle Passage was, as part of the system of slavery, was extremely inhumane. And so they're not getting any food. They're being transported as quickly and cheaply as possible, meaning that the food that they're receiving has zero nutritional value. And so West Africans, when they're being brought to different parts of the Atlantic world. So we're talking about what is now Canada, the United States, what's North America, parts of Western Europe, what the Caribbean. So this triangular, if you look on the map, it's kind of like a triangular shape. So that's the Atlantic world, hence the transatlantic slave trade. They're being distributed to various parts of the world, but they're taking their food practices with them. And so the reason why we hear soul food, sometimes if you are familiar, you might hear it being interchanged with the word Southern food or Southern cuisine. But there is a distinction, right? Southern food is food that is adopted from soul food. But soul food is specifically a Black cuisine. And the reason why is because when enslaved people were being brought to the Southern United States, they had to develop their own food. So the reason why it's synonymous with the Southern states is because soul food was brought out particularly within the South. So within the North and the South, systems of enslavement were drastically different. In the North, it was more like domestic. So there weren't really plantation styles of enslavement, meaning that enslaved people were usually working within homes as like, domestic workers, like maids, caregivers, and so on. And that usually meant that the food that they're eating was the same that their enslavers were eating. So they're all eating usually the same food, usually around the same spaces. But within the southern United States, we're seeing plantation styles. So they were seeing groups of like 50 people, 100 people, more, depending on the size of these plantations, meaning that enslaved people had to feed themselves and they weren't getting fed, right? So enslavers were not giving them high quality food if they're giving them food at all, which meant that they had to find food for themselves. But the foods that they were given, if anything, or the food that was nearby was usually scraps, scraps that enslavers didn't want to eat, scraps that meant to be thrown away. But enslaved people use these to their advantage and they say, well, how are we going to make them edible? How are we going to be able to use them to survive? And so soul food, we understand, is a method and system of ingenuity, a reflection of the ways in which enslaved people were able to take the little that they have and make it into something that now everybody enjoys, right? So many people talk about soul food, they eat soul food and they enjoy it, but not a lot of people understand that this is a food that was built out of dehumanization. And so we're seeing the roots of this soul food, and they're creating all this food, and they're making different forms of cuisine. And now we have fried chicken and cornbread. We see collard greens and so many different foods, but these are all built out of this cuisine of struggle. And so the soul food becomes like the predominant cuisine at the Underground Railroad restaurant, and a lot of people were able to enjoy. But again, that roots of that thing that don't people understand is that it was a part of struggle. And so the way that they developed it was also through what was available within the general area. So they had cornmeal, which was easier to grow in places where rice couldn't, and so it was easily accessible. Then there's pork, which was from pigs, just because pigs are again easily accessible. And then molasses, which was a byproduct of the sugar refining process. And so they combined this, and that's where we're starting to see like sugar, meat, and then cornmeal. And then over time, they continue to adapt it depending on what they had available. And then as the centuries go by, that continues to be refined over time until we have the soul food that we know now. And so again, it's that reminder that when you're eating soul food or you see soul food, you're reminded that this has a centuries long history, but is again the ways that the history is kind of rewritten, right? You don't really see conversations about soul food being attached to understanding the histories of enslavement and how dehumanizing these processes were. And so this restaurant, again, of course, no longer stands, but it is again that reminder of just like what parts of Toronto's history kind of disappear, even when just buildings disappear. And though there is a Heritage Toronto plaque there now that was recently put up a few years ago, it is that reminder that outside of the people who were able to visit this place themselves, how many people would be familiar with these spaces? And we've only been able to talk about just a short selection of this history that's just on King Street East, right? So this doesn't even touch on different places within Toronto, generally, Ontario, Canada. So you can only imagine just how many more sites there are. But it is again a reminder that as you go through the city, wherever you are, whether you're in Toronto, whether you're in Ontario, Canada, any other part of the world, to rethink the spaces that you're visiting. Think about, is there a deeper history here? Is there connections that I can make? Is there something else that I can know? Who lived here? Who resided here? Who worked there? What was their story? Right? There's so many questions. And that's why I started off with those two reflection questions, asking about what do you know about Black history in Toronto? Are there any sites near you that you can see that are attached to Black history? Because it's a way that thinking about how can you as an individual be engaged with the histories that are around you, because I guarantee that there's a lot. And so thank you for being here with me in this presentation. And again, this is again having the opportunity to have pictures of the people who established this restaurant. Is great to have an image of them. So this is Howard Matthews, Archie Allen, Dave Mann, and John Henry Jackson from 1970. And so again, they're a huge part of this history in Toronto. And so thank you for listening to this conversation. And so now we're inviting questions.
Thank you so much, Faith. That was fabulous. It's always a privilege to learn from you in every format. So I see that we have some hands raised. However, I'm going to ask if you have any questions, if you could drop them into the Q&A function of the chat or of the call, that would be great. So I see we already have some in the Q&A already. So Faith, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask them to you. So the first one, hi Faith, what do you think is the best way to learn and uncover these Black history stories? They said that they've never known how integral our country was really in the Underground Railroad.
Thank you so much for that question. That's a really good question. I think we're living in a really important time. I think information now has become a lot more accessible than has been before. I mean, there's a lot of online sources, so many more books, a lot of online sources that give us the opportunity to learn more about Canadian history and Black Canadian history. Even social media. I mean, there's a lot of people, historians, who even make posts and short posts on social media highlighting these particular spaces. And so I think it's even just about, I mean, the plaques around the city is a good starting point, right? Even just where you are, looking at those plaques, seeing if you're, when you're walking down the street, if there's any plaques that you see, then looking at that and then searching them up, seeing what more can you learn about this particular plaque, what else does it say? Isolating those names. Okay, you jot down those names and you look up the history of that person's name. Keep a list of those names. I always say, like, when you're going places and you're really interested in learning about history, just keep like a notebook on you and just jot down like any information that you see so that you always keep it in mind. And then just go from there. You'll be surprised just how much you learn, even when you're not expecting to, and just keeping a note of that and just being like reading as many books as you can, many articles as you can, and just being mindful of like the sources you read. Not, of course, not all sources are legitimate, but it is a starting point. And so once you have the inspiration to learn and you're willing to learn, you'll start to realize just how much information does start to come to you. Hope that answers your question.
I really like that a lot. And speaking of the plaques, for those who don't know, Heritage Toronto, we're the plaques people of the city. So when you see those plaques around the city, that's us. So thanks for the plug for those, Faith. We have another question. Someone is curious about how long the journey from the South, or specifically Kentucky, I guess referring to the Blackburns, to Ontario approximately would have been, if you have any idea.
Ooh, that is a really good question. And that's really one I'm curious about. I'm pretty sure there would be an answer somewhere. It's not coming to mind. But depending on certain journeys, if you're going from the south to the north, that could be hundreds of miles. If I'm
Right.
understanding like the number right, that could be like hundreds of miles. It really just depends on where you're traveling from and to. So when they're going from Kentucky to Detroit, that would have been a much longer journey. But when they were traveling from Detroit to what's now Windsor, Ontario, that would have been a shorter journey because they're just going over the border. Um, but yeah, traveling from north to south, I mean, is large. Like Canada is ginormous, and even the United States is large. So just traveling from one side to the other would have been really extensive journeys. Yeah, even just if you are curious, I think you should just search up like articles that talk about that, even maps that kind of explore that. Because there are usually maps that kind of give a general sense. I know like when we're talking, like people talk about like the journeys that Harriet Tubman, for example, made. Those were like 100 miles, and they were really treacherous. But I'm sure I don't, so I can't give a clear answer, but that is something to really think about, like how extensive were these journeys, right? Is really important to understanding just how significant these moments in history were. So thank you for that question.
Yeah. I know in the 90s there was a historian that kind of did like wanted to see what it would have been like. And so in the 90s he kind of tried to embark and follow the same route and with far less limitations than what would have been actually traveling the Underground Railroad. It was like about 6 weeks. So I can't even imagine back then.
Yeah.
So we have another question. Wasn't Frederick Douglass also present at the Convention of Colored Freemen?
Oh, yeah, about that. He wasn't actually present at the convention itself. He did eventually speak at St. Lawrence Hall later, but he never actually went to the North American Convention. But he did put in some of his thoughts about the convention. He actually felt that he didn't entirely agree with the outcome of the convention. So the outcome was that Black immigration to Canada would be the most suitable. But Frederick Douglass was actually kind of opposed to that idea. Not because he wasn't opposed about like enslaved people and other Black people of obtaining freedom and safety, but he was more against the idea that he wanted them to receive freedom in the United States. So he didn't like the idea that his people had to leave the country to be able to obtain freedom. So it was more about his sense of, of rights, right? He wanted the same country that took those rights away to be the place where they obtained them. So he didn't want it to be just as like, we're just going to leave and then hope things get better. He's like, well, we want change to be made where we are. And so, yeah, that's a good question. But he did eventually speak at St. Lawrence Hall, but at a later date.
Um, oh, we have somebody who said that they actually got to experience some dinners at the Underground Railroad restaurant. They put in quotations back in the day.
That's
That's really
awesome.
nice. We have a question about the Underground Railroad restaurant. So, they said that they know that Archie was a musician, but just wanted to know if you have any other information about any of the other owners.
Yes, a few of the other owners are actually football players. They worked with the Toronto Argonauts. So that was really interesting. So many of them, um, I think three of them actually. I know that there is information that we will highlight soon of where you can find additional information. But yes, there is a place that you can look soon to find out information more about each of them.
Yeah, so spoiler, Faith is actually, as an emerging historian with us, she's also created a digital map tour of being Black on King. So I will send to all of you who have participated today a link to the map tour if you wish to learn more, if you wish to refer back to anything, if you wish to share anything you've learned with anybody you know. I'll send you a link to the map tour and you can kind of dig deeper and refer back to what you learned today. Um, so we have another question. Sorry, I had it and I've just lost it. We have someone asking if cassava, okra, and smoked salted fish are considered soul foods as well.
I'm, I will admit I'm not the biggest expert on soul food, and my history doesn't really focus on food history as much. But I do know that those foods are particularly more common in the Caribbean. Caribbean food has a really interesting connection to soul food, mostly because again, the same transfers of like West African cooking traditions are also similar to some cooking traditions within Caribbean. So cassava and okra, for example, are a lot more common in the Caribbean. But I do know that it does eventually become integrated within soul food as well. So I guess it depends on certain groups. I'm not sure when those would become introduced within soul food, but I would say yes.
Mhm. Um, nice. So we have somebody who kindly pointed out that Albert Jackson was featured on a Canadian postage stamp.
Yes, he was.
Um, yeah, that's a very, very nice commemoration. Um, Someone's asking if you know why the Underground Railroad restaurant closed.
Um, no, actually. But that is a good question that I wasn't actually able to find about why exactly it closed. It might just have been like it might have just been an internal issue, might have just been like operation costs. It is really unfortunate, but unfortunately, I'm not actually exactly sure why. I'd also like to know.
Mhm. Um, we have someone asking, why do you think that the Blackburn's house was ended up being the first Underground Railroad site to be excavated?
Ooh, it is a really interesting question. Um, I think it does again come to the point of like isolating Black history and learning like where Black history comes from. Dr. Carolyn Smart Frost actually she wrote her book about the Blackburns, and so if anyone does have questions about the Blackburns, I would highly suggest you to read that book because she talks a lot about their life, and she also talks about a lot of the surrounding area, right? So she kind of maps out their life, maps out the kind of different places that they were. Um, and the different places that they contributed to, where they went to, and just the general history of Toronto at that time. And so that might give you a sense of like how she came to arriving about learning about the Blackburns in the first place. But I think it does boil down to just the prioritization of like Black history. But like this is also way in 1985. It does become a point like when does Black history start to become prioritized? It definitely wasn't a huge thing within the 1980s as it is now. And so that might be a point factor. It might even just be a coincidence, right? Like it might have just been like we stumbled upon this and it just so happens that now it is the first underground railroad stop to be excavated. So that is a really good question of like why, how do these things become the first and why are they the first? Is a good way of thinking about it. But I would definitely suggest looking at the book just to find out more about it just in general.
Nice. Same on the topic of the Blackburns. Someone's asking if you could repeat or kind of elaborate on the connection between the Blackburns and the Jacksons.
Oh yes, thank you. That's a good question. That was just the connection I was talking about was just when we think about the Blackburns and how when the Black community within Detroit heard that they were going to be returned back to slavery in Kentucky, the Black community there is the one that protested on their behalf to make sure that they wouldn't be returned, right? And they did everything in their power to keep them safe. It reminded me when I was talking about the Albert Jackson and the way that the Black community is the one that protested for Albert Jackson's behalf to make sure that he got his job back was the connection that I was making of just this the contributions of the Black community of making sure that change is taking place and being the ones to initiate that engagement to make sure that they're helping Black community members to receive freedom of being safe was a connection that I was making that the community interference is the highlight.
Mhm. Yeah. And I know that that connection was kind of immemorialized in the Toronto necropolis, where the
Mhm.
Blackburns are buried, the Toronto necropolis in Cabbagetown.
Mhm.
Um, Anne Maria and one of the sons are buried in the same plot, right where the Blackburns are,
Yes.
which I think is really nice.
Yes, yeah.
Um, we have another question asking, first of all, thanking you for your insights and saying it was a brilliant presentation. Um, and so this is from Dr. Eleanor stating that their concern is moving the power structures from celebrating a holiday, I imagine like Emancipation Day, to actually forcing legislation. So their question is how to change or any suggestions to change the educational system strategically to address kind of the racism that's ongoing.
Wow, that's a really, really good question. And
Question.
it's one that I think about a lot, right? I mean, I'm in, as being a university student, I don't always have to think about, mostly because like you're taking classes where you're talking about that. So you're not in a classroom, especially with like a public school classroom, for example, thinking about like, what am I not learning and going to like, what did I even learn in class today? But it is something that I reflect back on when I think, well, when I was in public school, how many things did I not learn that I am learning now? And it has been thinking that I reflected on. It's like it's not a coincidence that suddenly when I'm in university is when I'm starting learning this whole threshold of information that we didn't get when schooling was quote unquote free. And so the way that I've always thought about it is, honesty is the first step, right? Of actually being able to just recognize and say, Canada did this, Canada was involved in this, and then not throwing the blame over. So I was mentioning, or like it was easy for us to recognize like the United States' role in the history of slavery and colonialism, but we kind of push that aside when it comes to Canada, and we're like, well, Canada did it if we acknowledge that Canada did it, because sometimes that's not even acknowledged at all, but it's we throw the blame first and then we don't even acknowledge Canada's role. And so the first step about addressing that, especially with like an education and enforcing policies, is to be honest, right? Is saying like Canada did do this because we can't pretend that we can do any kind of legislation if we're not even willing to be transparent about these histories. And then I think is about having those like internal conversations, right? We can't always wait for the education system to become better. So what we first have to do is have those conversations with ourselves, with the people around us, with children, right? It's the children who are the ones who are going to have to continue to carry on that burden of having to educate themselves, unfortunately, which is happens a lot, right? This is not a coincidence that so many of the histories we talk about aren't well known, even for people who are in those communities. Sometimes they don't even know the histories that are right around them. And that's all, again, not a coincidence, right? It's been a very intentional thing throughout Canadian history of making education to just be about limiting what people know, not about giving them an opportunity, not about making things equal, but about making people as deprived from information so that they're easier to control, easier to just to push out of the way. Is never about being transparent. And so if we want to make any next steps, we have to be honest first and talk to children. Children have so much information, so much knowledge that I think really gets downplayed. And when we can sit with children and say, well, children aren't too young to know about these histories, we don't need to make excuses. I think that is the first step again of how we make it more accessible and how we can make changes for the future is by engaging children in those conversations and letting them be engaged so that as they grow, they can continue to be their own historians, they can be their own educators, but then making sure that we're talking to people and we're constantly pushing back. Because again, I think we're in that particular time where that pushback is becoming a bit easier because there's so many avenues that we have now. But that's a fantastic question because there is no clear-cut answer. There's so many methods, but we have to be willing to be educators and learn for ourselves first, and then we can continue to push outward.
Mhm, mhm. We have a question saying, isn't it ironic that the Freedman's Bank was trying to spread propaganda that formerly enslaved people didn't know how to work hard?
Yes, I was thinking about that. I remember reading like the quotes about it, and I was like, "What do you mean, right? Like, how do you mean teaching them to be frugal, right?" And the example I was thinking about, like the Blackburns themselves, right? They were entrepreneurs. They were highly engaged in their community. And imagine going to the Blackburns and being like, "Okay, I'm going to teach you how to be frugal." Like, you're not going to go to an entrepreneur and be like, "I want to teach you how to start a business." It's like, no, right? But it is really ironic. But again, it's the intentionality, right? It's the thing of like, we're going to commandeer and we're going to show up and we're just going to tell you how to behave and how to exist is a whole thing we see throughout the history of slavery, and especially within abolition, that there were a lot of abolitionists And that's again that thing like people hear abolition and be like, oh yes, this is a good person because they're trying to abolish slavery. But there were a lot of abolitionists who were also very pro-slavery. They just had their own different reasons for why they wanted to abolish slavery. But it was the way that they would talk to enslaved people and the way that they would exploit them, which usually of the way like, oh, we just want to hear like your stories of enslavement, but we don't actually want to engage with you. Actually, Albert Jackson himself talks about that in his second biography when he talks about his role of being an abolitionist. He speaks about how he was spoken to by a lot of other white abolitionists and how they were like, we don't want you to actually be like a leader or anything. There's a famous quote when he's like something along the lines of, you handle the facts and we'll deal with the philosophy, was something on the lines of one of them then said to him. But it was this idea of, we just want you to speak about your experience, but you don't need to be have a mind of your own. You don't need to be a leader. You don't have to have any like personal thoughts. Just say the facts and that's it. But when we see like the Freedman's Bank and the propaganda there is again is all part of that history of just like of minimizing the existence of enslaved people just so that they could just be exploited. But even in these systems, they were never seeing them as actual people.
Mhm. Mhm. You have a lot of questions, Faith. We have another question, and I guess this kind of might lead into a bigger conversation, but if you know where they can find marriage certificates from the 1860s of St. John's Ward Black residents. So I guess if you know about that or any connections to the ward.
That is a good question. And I'm not familiar with marriage records as much, but I do know that churches within areas, they usually still keep those. They're supposed to usually still have them, if I'm thinking about that correctly. It's not something that they can just be like, okay, we're just going to toss them into the fire and destroy them. Um, and so those usually marriage records are usually accessible somewhere and usually openly available, right? There's only becomes a certain time that if things are 100 years, they become public domain. So they're just open records, they're openly accessible. So if anything dealing with St. John's Ward, um, there should be, if there's any churches that were near there, if they are still standing, they should still have those marriage records. As to how to look at them, I'm not entirely sure, but I would definitely look more into that because if there are churches that are still standing, they would definitely still have to have those marriage records if they were holding them. So St. John's, where most of the area was has been is demolished, it no longer exists. But that's where the City Hall, Eaton Center area is. So I don't know how many churches would be near that area, but that would be something to look into. So thank you for bringing that up.
Mhm. And I guess maybe for those who aren't familiar with the ward, do you have any words maybe about why the ward might have had a lot of Black residents?
Yes, well, the St. John's Ward was a huge area. There was various groups of immigrants that were situated within the ward, and so there's all groups of immigrants were in St. John's Ward. But unfortunately, it was a very like rundown area. It wasn't really well maintained, mostly because they weren't getting any support. And that belongs to a very huge history with Canadian history of like not supporting the communities that immigrants reside in. So that's a huge history. That also connects even when we were talking about the Freedmen's Bank and the whole thing of like the enslaved people who put their money there weren't getting the money back is a thing that happens even now, where there are groups of Black people and other group people of color are usually marginalized from being able to obtain loans and mortgages. And that's part of the system called redlining. And so when we're talking about the ward, it's this huge community that had various groups of immigrants, but they weren't getting any support. And that's part of the kind of justification that the government had when they demolished the area was like, well, it's run down and it's not prosperous anymore, so we'll just wipe it out and make it part of the metropolitan area. There's a huge thing about that with just gentrification within Canada, and so St. John's Wort is a huge part of that history.
Mhm. Um, you mentioned churches a bit ago about the marriage certificate question. So someone is asking that from Nancy, that since Christian faith and community was vitally important to early Black folks settling in York/Toronto, she's wondering if you know if there were any specific churches that welcomed Black families at the time and if they would still exist today.
Wow, that's a really good question too. Everyone's asking such wonderful questions that
I
make
had never
me
thought
want to
of that
learn
one
more
before.
too. I'm actually not sure. And I'm sorry I don't have a clear cut answer for that, but there are a lot of churches. I mean, there's a lot of churches in Toronto. There's a lot that are no longer standing. And so I'm not actually sure. I think, for example, one church I know that's actually quite relevant is actually Little Trinity Anglican Church, that was right beside actually Enoch Schoolhouse. So it was also located this faces King Street East. And it was actually really interesting church because Lucie and Thornton Blackburn actually were one of the first contributors to that church. And the person who established that church, he was actually involved in keeping the Blackburns in Canada. Um, his name was John Strawn, spelled Strachan, John Strawn. And so his churches were actually, he made sure that his churches were not racially segregated. So at least that is one example that I could think of a church that was at least not racially discriminated again, that didn't practice racial segregation, at least as long as he was aware. So that is one example that I can think of, but I can only hope that there were a lot of other churches that follow that same pattern.
Mm.
Good question.
Yeah. So we have another one, I guess kind of a more general question about the entire theme of the tour, and that's from Catherine. She's asking, why is King Street specifically so important to the Black community? I guess why does King Street specifically have so mmany of these sites?
I think it's just one example of many other examples of King Street. I've always said that Toronto has like four downtowns. I always joke. Because there's like the King Street East area is like that part of downtown, and then there's like when you get closer to like City Hall area, I think that's kind of its own downtown. And I think if you talk to think of like any area in downtown, they have a very similar history. Just because just Toronto was just a huge center itself. And King Street East is just one example of that. Um, which again shows like if this much history can be drawn out of King Street East, has how many more can be drawn out of just all the other streets. And so King Street East is not an exception, it's just an example.
Mhm.
But yeah, Toronto itself, just because of how quickly it was modernizing, it had a lot of attraction of bringing people in. And we see that even now, like Toronto remains a hotspot of just of activity. And so it's always been that way. And so yeah, King Street East is just one example of just this huge type of history.
Yeah. Yeah, I would have to entirely agree. I think like when I think of like Thornton Blackburn, how his taxi cab was parked outside right at King and Church.
Mhm.
There could be many reasons for that. I think part of it could be that part was even more downtown socially than it even could
Yeah.
have been. Now you have St. Lawrence Market there, which has always kind of been a center point for people coming for trading, buying and selling. So that could also be part of it. But Faith's
Yeah.
absolutely right that it's not an exception, it's an example. I love how you said that. Back to the church's question, Kathy Grant is in the chat, and she said that St. James Cathedral um, would have also accepted Black people coming.
Nice.
Um, we have two more comments about the Blackburns. We have Nancy saying that isn't it wonderful that the Cherry Street YMCA has a meeting space named the Lucie and Thornton Blackburn Meeting Hall. That's very
That's
nice.
wonderful. Yeah.
And speaking of the Blackburns, we have a question from Karen asking if the plaques that are kind of inside of the school now on the school grounds, if you think that the plaques would ever be moved off of the school property one day and maybe kind of closer to a public roadway where they're viewable.
That would be nice, even just outside of the fence, right?
Yeah.
The thing is like the school is on the property, and then there's a fence that closes off the property, and then the plaques are like right on the other side of that fence. So if the gate is closed, you just kind of have to like kind of peek through the fence to see, and that's really hard. So even if they just move the plaques just outside of the fence, would make it so it wouldn't matter if the gate is open. If you're just passing by the street, you'd be able to read them and actually access them. That
Mhm.
would even just be enough so at least it's still near the property because that is the site. So if it was moved somewhere else, it might not be, it wouldn't be contextual anymore. But having it on the other side of the fence is really all they would need to do.
Yeah, I agree. Um, we have another question asking if you know where the 40 acres and a mule idea comes from. And if that was promised to ex-slaves as a result of the Abolition Act.
Um, that's a good question. And I'm actually not sure, but I can imagine, there would have been a lot of false promises that were made during abolition. Many that obviously were not that never actually were promised, that were never actually received, that were given. One thing we do actually was promised through abolition was that enslavers would actually be paid. So whether it was in parts of the Caribbean, whether it's part of the states, when abolition was taking place and the promises and conversations about abolition, enslavers were the ones that were actually being promised compensation, and they were the ones who received it. So people who were emancipated didn't receive any, of course, any compensation. All they were promised was that they would get, in the Caribbean, there was something called apprenticeship, was supposed to allow enslaved people to continue to work for those who had previously enslaved them. But for like, it was supposed to be to teach them how to be free. Again, the heavy quotations, right? Because it was just another way of enforcing the continuation of slavery. But enslavers were the ones that were receiving compensation. So they got paid when slavery ended. And they're the only ones that receive that compensation because it was supposed to help them fill their wage gap. Because now that they're no longer receiving enslaved labor, they got the money so that they would be able to continue to stay afloat during this moment of abolition. So that's a really good question.
So as we have 5 minutes left, I'm just going to ask two final questions. But before I do that, for those who are slowly starting to make your exit, we have some questions about if it's being recorded or if the recording will be uploaded. We will keep you updated on that. We have your emails. So if we do upload it to YouTube, we will send out an email and let you all know. So the last two questions, one is a bit of a longer one, and I'll end with the shortest one. So the longer one is, if you, in your opinion, if you see, what do you see as kind of the main impediments today in Canada that are kind of hampering, they say, full and respectful integration?
Integration, I think, if I'm wondering if you mean like integration in terms of like communities or integration of knowledge. But one thing I do think is just the myth making around Canada and Canadian history and our understanding of Canada itself. We hear, like, I always call it the myth of Canadian niceness is one of the things that kind of permeates our understanding of Canadian history. This thing of like Canadians are so nice and this is so nice and here people are so nice here and Canada didn't do these things. I think that's one of the most like impediments to it is just the restriction that there's a lot that can happen because we're living on a false sense of what Canada is as a country. And so much of this history that has been unacknowledged for so long and continues to be unacknowledged, while also being reshaping Canada to be this place that it's not. And we see it constantly. And that's why I always make the comparison to what Canada, the United States is, because as soon as something happens in the United States, as soon as Canada comes into the conversation, it's not usually to be like, oh, that should be an opportunity for us to isolate and understand Canadian history more. It's always a way of Canada trying to be like, well, at least we're not as bad as this, right? It's that kind of thing. And I think that's what is the largest impediment to any integration, whether it's integration of people, whether it's integration of knowledge, is because we keep making up myths about Canada that just aren't true.
Yeah, yeah, entirely. Um, so the last question is, I mean, so somebody's asking, firstly, if you have a social media page that people can follow.
Only a LinkedIn page. I know I haven't done social media, but I do have a LinkedIn page.
And your name is just the same on LinkedIn?
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect. So the last question is also about social media. So if you have any social media accounts, and if like that you would recommend, and if not social media accounts, either individuals, organizations, or sources that you can recommend to learn more about Black history in Canada. I think this is going back to one of the first questions somebody asked
Yeah, I
about.
think when if you do look at a certain map, there would be sources at the bottom to look at or digital map. There's a few sources I've listed there that I think are a really good starting point. And even just looking at those authors, looking at the other works that they have done. There are some good pages on the Canadian Encyclopedia that mentions about Black history and talking about Black history there. Those are a good starting point as well, and they're accessible pieces of information, so it's open access, it's free. But I would just suggest going to like your local library, looking at your public library, looking at Black authors, looking at reading lists and see what historians are being suggested. I find that you should look at academic sources that are openly and freely available as easily, as quickly as you can. I think those are good ways of obtaining accurate and important information about Black history. But if you're just looking at quick articles, there's a lot of like Canadian Encyclopedia articles that do a good job of putting out in real information by historians usually.
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And also, in addition to Faith's content that's on the Heritage Toronto site, Heritage Toronto has tons of content online about Black history. We have a story about the Toronto necropolis, and all the Black Torontonians that are buried there. We have a story about Black placemaking. We have a story about steel pan music and its history in Toronto, Little Jamaica. So Heritage Toronto as well. And that brings us to 8:30. So thank you so much, Faith. Really,
Thank
you did
you.
an amazing job. Round of applause for Faith from home, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, sharing your knowledge with us. Again, it's a privilege to learn from you. If any of you would like to learn more from Faith specifically, please check out the walking tour version of this presentation, Being Black on King, and you can actually walk the route and walk the stops with us in the summertime. So be on the lookout for that on our website soon. I'm not sure if the link was able to be sent in the chat to the map tour, but I've sent it there, but I will send it out using Eventbrite. So check your Eventbrite emails to get the link for the map tour as well. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, I hope everybody has a wonderful evening and a wonderful weekend. Bye, everyone.